Thank you, Michael. Our second speaker is Duncan Stroik, known to so many of you. His architectural practice grows out of a commitment to the principles of humanist architecture and urbanism. For over a decade, he has focused on the design of ecclesiastical, civil, and residential buildings which are well built, convenient, and beautiful. Duncan's education and career have closely paralleled the evolution of the international movement to recovery classic architecture. And over the past decade, his work has been instrumental in the new renaissance of sacred architecture. Duncan Stroik received his architectural education from the University of Virginia and Yale University. Following graduation, he served as a project designer for the architect Alan Greenberg, with whom he designed a number of prestigious civil, institutional, collegiate, and residential projects. In 1990, Duncan was invited to help form and implement a new curriculum in classical architecture at the University of Notre Dame, later hailed by the New York Times as the Athens of the new movement. Duncan's involvement in the new renaissance of sacred architecture has led to the formation of the Institute for Sacred Architecture at Notre Dame and the Sacred Architecture Journal, of which he is editor. In addition to publishing and lecturing, Duncan Stroik has also organized conferences in America and Europe, led seminars in Italy, and has been featured in the mass media. He has designed projects for houses in New England, Chicago, and Ireland, churches in California, Kansas, Connecticut, and Ohio, as well as other civic buildings. He is presently designing ecclesiastical projects for Nebraska, Kentucky, and California, along with an elementary school in Virginia and a monastery in Chicago. Duncan continues to develop his practice with a focus on civic and residential architecture. My pleasure to present to you Duncan Stroik speaking on the altar as the center of the church.
Thank you very much. Grazie, Padre Pericone. Thank you for having me, and thanks especially to Dorothy McCartney and Jim Merlino for bringing me here and taking care of me, and also for the slide projectors and lights and all that sort of thing, the bells and whistles. I've been dying to get into the Yale Club for years, and even though I am a Yale graduate, I've never been in here, and I didn't realize that you had to come to Christa Fidelis to get into the Yale Club, so now it's kind of nice. I thought it was very nice that Michael began and ended his talk with these quotes from Victor Hugo's book, but I have a little bone to pick with him. I always thought it was The Hunchback of Notre Dame. What's this Hunchback of Notre Dame stuff? Michael Rose, I just want to especially congratulate and thank him. I mean, I can't think of anyone else alive today who's done more to try to galvanize support for our old churches. I mean, this guy has really gone out there in the trenches and really taken on saving our beautiful churches in that consistent ethic of pro-life ethic here. He's just amazing. Father mentioned the title of Michael's new book about why are churches so darn ugly. And I was reminded of this yesterday being at Washington Square, and there are two churches right there. And somebody had to pick me up, and one is a Catholic church. It's this beautiful early Christian church with the campanile, and the other is this meeting house. For some reason, they got switched, and the Catholics are in the kind of concrete meeting house, and it's the Baptists who built the Catholic church next door. And very strange, Stanford White building. When the people were coming to pick me up, they said, "Well, where are you? There's two churches there. Which church is it?" I said, "Well, I'm in front of the Catholic church, the ugly one." And they laughed. Father mentioned this idea of lex orandi, lex credendi, and then he proposed lex edificandi, and I thought that was something that I feel very strongly about. And it's very timely because, as you know, the Vatican this week just came out with, I think, and maybe Father Baker will clarify this, I think a pretty stunning document, Liturgiam Authenticam. Amazing. And I think that our liturgical friends are probably in just great fear at this point. But anyways, there's one little quote from this document which has to do mainly with translation of documents and for the liturgy particularly, norms for the translation of the Bible as well as liturgical prayers. And one of the things that it says is, at the same time, it must be acknowledged that while liturgical prayer is formed by the culture which practices it, it is also formative of culture, so that the relationship is not merely passive. So, lex edificandi, as Father said. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that, and specifically about how one might conceive of a church today, starting with the altar. Liturgiam Authenticam. I'm still waiting for the next Vatican document, Architectiam Authenticam. That's what we're very hopeful for. Some of us, anyways. So, anyway, could I have the first two slides and have the lights dimmed? Okay, you recognize these two buildings. As we enter the third millennium of Christianity, it is a most appropriate time to look back on the architecture of the past millennium, including the architecture of the century. Being surrounded in New York by some of the finest examples of how previous generations have honored Christ's birth through material construction, I think it's appropriate that we ask for this generation, how shall we then build? Next. On the left, you see the model, the design for the new. This one should go back. Nope, back. Up for the Los Angeles Cathedral here on the left. Started out at $53 million, and then went up slight budget increase to $153 million. And I'm told that we won't be surprised if it just keeps going up. I mean, just incrementally, maybe up to $200 million. On the right, we have the new John Paul II Center in Washington, D.C. So two of the most important new Catholic buildings in our country. Focusing on the Catholic architecture constructed since the Second World War, we are struck by the great change that has taken place in our portrayal of the sacred. I'm speaking of the abstract and unrecognizable forms, the minimalist spaces, unnatural materials, and the lack of figurative sacred art which describe the majority of our churches built since 1945. For some, modernist architecture is seen as the embodiment of the spirit of Vatican II, symbolizing the necessary renewal of the Church in her liturgy. To others, these churches are seen as anti-traditional, symbolizing all that was wrong with the Vatican Council. Neither view seems to sufficiently consider the facts. To the student of architectural history, the architecture built by the Catholic Church during the past 50 years as a whole does not seem to be all that different from secular trends. And I recently spoke to someone who's quite close to the Holy Father and asked him, what's the deal about building a building like this to honor the pontificate of this great philosopher and great Polish Pope, who many of us think will be canonized a saint very quickly. And his response was, and this is someone who knows the Pope quite well, he says, well, it was a very nice thing to build this building in honor of the Holy Father, but why did they have to pick an architecture that reminds one of Stalinist-era nuclear power plants? Next. This is a typical church on the West Coast, recently built, and this is something from a picture from Environment and Art and Catholic Worship in 1977. Now, speaking of the Holy Father, There's a great quote a few years ago in Italian that he made. C'è poco senso del sacro nelle nuove chiese. This is Italian for, there is little sense of the sacred in the new churches. Many Catholics have thought or said this in recent decades, but it took the Holy Father, John Paul II, to bring the issue to the fore after his visit to a church in the periphery of Rome 2 years ago. As I understand it, this comment from John Paul II caused a bit of a stir in the Italian media, and Cardinal Ruini has reiterated the Pope's concerns in his own addresses to architects and artists. Why is it that churches of the past are in general more sacred than many of our recent prayer barns? Have aspects of church architecture been lost which can be regained? Next. Two other kind of typical things, one on the West Coast and one in the Midwest. But in regaining aspects of liturgical architecture, it is too easy to merely produce a banal traditionalism, which is not much better than the strident iconoclasm of modernism. Is there a conceptual framework that will allow us to make educated judgments about the design and renovation of the Domus Dei? One way is by considering the nature of the Holy Liturgy and the centrality of the altar in the celebration. That is, in order to design a beautiful church, we should begin with a beautiful altar. Next. Next. This is the design of Bramante for the Tempietto on the spot where St. Peter was supposedly crucified in the Rome, and this is San Lorenzo fuori le mura. Often when I describe a church building, I begin with the exterior and proceed into the nave towards the sanctuary, because this is the way that we experience a church. But another way of thinking about the church, theologically as well as architecturally, is to begin with the church's raison d'etre, the holy altar, and allow the building to grow up from there. It is my contention that if we design a material altar which adequately portrays its meaning, and then allow the rest of the church to harmonize with the altar, then we may be able to once again return the sense of the sacred to our modern churches. Next. Here we have one artist's rendition of what the temple in Jerusalem may have looked like, with a series of courts before the actual building. And here we have a reconstruction of the earliest known house church, the church at Dura Europos, around the year 200. One cannot have a place set apart for celebrating the liturgy without an altar. From earliest times, the altar has been the hierarchical center of the church, the focus of the liturgy, and a representation of Christ. In the first examples we have of churches, such as at Dura Europos in Asia Minor, in the house, which has become the Domus Ecclesia, we find a room with an altar table. And you can see this better than I can. Here you have the room with the altar table, perhaps the sacristy, the courtyard, baptistry, probably the room for the catechumens, and so they could listen to the liturgy, listen to the sermon, what have you. The rites for the dedication of a church put it this way. The altar of a church stands as a sign of Christ himself, who is the priest, the victim, and the altar of his own sacrifice. The altar can be seen as embodying the table of the Last Supper, the altar of the Temple of Jerusalem, the cross of Calvary, the tomb of Christ's death and burial, and the altar in heaven. The design and construction of the altar should embody meal and sacrifice, and the design of the whole church will aid in this understanding through its planning and iconography. Next. The British author Paul Johnson would have it that American Catholics are simply Calvinists who go to Mass. And I believe that His Eminence Cardinal George has made similar remarks. In a time when there is great misunderstanding of the meaning of the Mass and belief in the real presence of Christ, it is important that we re-emphasize the Church's teaching through the medium of beautiful liturgy and a sacramental architecture. It is important also that we reappropriate the meaning of the altar and how it is represented. During the Counter-Reformation, the Protestant denial of the real presence of the Eucharist led the Catholic Church to respond by creating large and beautiful tabernacles joining them with the altar, and by employing biblical and Christian imagery, supporting the doctrine within spacious churches. We must create the equivalent art and architecture for our own time. Next. Pope John Paul II has spoken of treating holy objects with holy respect. The most holy object in a church, the altar, which is also the focus of the Mass, deserves the greatest attention to design and the greatest relative expenditure. It should be constructed with the finest materials possible and have a most elegant and beautiful design. The altar also needs to be the most permanent part of the church, with its own foundations. And for this, we understand why it receives its own separate consecration. Next. There are infinite ways to design a holy and beautiful altar, always seeking to portray its liturgical meaning. In all cases, the Church has a long-standing preference for stone, especially for the mensa, the top part. Pope St. Sylvester, around the year 314, who was the patron of St. John Lateran, is said to be the first to have made stone altars obligatory. St. John Chrysostom writes that this altar is an object of wonder. By nature, it is stone, but it is made holy when it receives the body of Christ. It is this mensa which is anointed at the time of dedication, much like Christ's body was anointed before his death. Because it is a holy object, we also incense the altar. Next. These are very different altars. The question for us is, how can the design of the altar, and by extension the area around it, indicate its sacredness and the honor it deserves? People, whether Catholic or not, are quite intelligent about these things, and an altar which is a simple wooden table or an abstract metal structure will not be approached with the awe and reverence it actually deserves. An abstract or minimalist object may be fine to read a book on or to eat sandwiches off of, but it can never fully hold our attention. Next. The mensa, or top stone, receives relics of the saints, following the early tradition of celebrating Mass over the tombs of the martyrs. As the Eucharist is a joining of the Church in Christ's sacrifice, it can be expressed in the body of a holy man or woman who exhibited that sacrifice in their life. That is, the body or relic of the saint is a material reminder of Christ's own one immemorial sacrifice and bodily death. St. Ambrose explains that in this way, the triumphant victims may occupy the place where Christ is victim. He, however, who suffered for all, upon the altar. They, who have been redeemed by his sufferings, beneath the altar. This is why altars have been dedicated or named after saints, often the relics of whom are placed there. It should also be constructed out of the finest materials. This will entail a generous allotment of funds. It is not unreasonable to think about the cost of a large marble altar as the equivalent of buying a Lexus, a BMW, or a sport utility vehicle. Next. Here's another award-winning altar for eating sandwiches off of. And this is the early design for the sanctuary of the Los Angeles Cathedral. And can you find the altar? It's right there. In general, the recommendation that a new altar be freestanding so that the priest may walk around it and may offer Mass versus Populum has not been well answered by architects and artisans in our designs for modern churches. In seeking to make the altar more prominent and return to the early Christian understanding of it, we have instead diminished its importance architecturally. A freestanding block of stone, or perhaps a cantilever of 3 feet tall and 5 feet wide, set within a sanctuary 30 to 40 feet wide, or in the LA Cathedral 100 feet wide, gets lost. To overcome this, the freestanding altar should include steps to elevate it in importance, surround it by archways, railings, candlesticks, which can act like supporting actors in a play. Next. This is Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, and this is the Oratorian Church in England. In all of the early Christian basilicas, starting with St. John Lateran in Rome, the altar was set within a baldacchino, or ciborium, normally 4 columns and beams that define an edicule or holy place. The baldacchino helps define an altar precinct and extends the presence of the altar horizontally and vertically into the body of the church. This is particularly advantageous for a stone altar within a large, spacious sanctuary. A smaller church or chapel can often do without the baldacchino, although the theological meaning is still beneficial. Usually, Corinthian columns hold a type of canopy symbolizing the tent in the wilderness which sheltered the Ark of the Covenant, and the veil in the Holy of Holies in the temple in Jerusalem. While the altar represents Christ, the baldacchino or tester above symbolizes the Holy Spirit. And again, of course, we have a baldacchino at Santa Maria Maggiore, a really phenomenal piece of architecture. And here we have the high altar and a tester, this hanging baldachin or hanging drapery over the altar to focus there. So, if we have a beautiful altar, then should we not make the sanctuary and the church beautiful as well? Next. The area surrounding the altar should help to frame it, to create a threshold, to set it off, and to grow out of it architecturally. One might call this the centripetal force of the altar, that it draws us to itself, and at the same time it imparts sacredness to the area surrounding it, and eventually to the whole church. If we have designed a noble and costly altar, it should not be placed in a room which is barren and crude, which would take away from the sacrament and would dishonor it. Rather, the altar should have a setting of beauty and fine materials in order to give it due honor. This area, which includes the floor, the walls, and the ceiling, is known as the sanctuary, the holy place. The sanctuary can be thought of as the equivalent to the Holy of Holies in the temple in Jerusalem. The greatest loss of the sense of the sacred in our churches in recent decades has been the disregard or demotion of the sanctuary within the house of God. Next. Chiesa Nuova and Santa Maria della Grazia in Milano. As the place of higher arch or sacred order, the sanctuary is the most hierarchical area within the church. A raised sanctuary has the benefit of allowing the faithful to better see the action of the sanctuary from the nave. The floor of the sanctuary should be designed with a pattern and out of materials which focus on the altar, often by the use of banding or contrasting color. If possible, hire the cosmati to come back from Italy to do your floor. The design of the altar can affect the rest of the church in much the same way as a boat in a lake creates waves which ripple out until they reach the shore. Next. Okay, this is a good one. Because of the lessening of the distinctiveness of the sanctuary, we are brought to almost humorous situations in which signs to keep out are placed where once people understood not to enter. This is a fairly major chapel at the University of Notre Dame, Basilica. I don't know if you can read this wonderful sign right there, right? They placed this there after the Mass. It says, "This section closed. Please do not enter." In the new chapel designed by Philip Johnson at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, there's a brochure in which visitors are told, maybe you can even read it here, do not enter the raised sanctuary, and in parentheses, the altar area. Probably because people would not otherwise know from the architectural design. This is the sanctuary, so-called, but please don't enter it. One of the reasons the sense of enclosure is not adequately expressed in many of our contemporary churches seems to be due to an antagonism towards the altar rail, which seems to be one of the most hated traditional elements of many designers and liturgical consultants. And I was recently talking with Monsignor Clark from St. Agnes, and he told the story of how he fought very hard and also argued theologically and liturgically for the altar rail. And at the end of the day, those who did not want the altar rail didn't really have an argument to stand on, because altar rails aren't even mentioned in church documents. So it's I think one of the wonderful things about that new church. Next. The walls of the sanctuary can surround the altar and enframe it, often articulated with panels, pilasters, or columns to give scale. These elements become the backdrop, like a landscape within a Renaissance portrait, which always adds to the meaning of the portrayed. The design of the apse or rear wall is especially crucial as a focus of the sanctuary and often will display Christological or Trinitarian imagery in paintings or statuary. Being the backdrop for the altar, the apse is an important focus of the church and therefore an appropriate place for an image of the titular saint or a crucifix to represent the sacrifice of the Mass. Next. This is Palladio again on the left, and this is Michelangelo and company at St. Peter's. Architecture of all cultures has always honored important objects and rites within rooms of vertical proportions. One thinks of Congress halls, throne rooms, library reading rooms, banqueting halls, temples. Just as the priest prays that the angel will take our sacrifice to God's altar in heaven, the sanctuary should imply this vertical access to heaven, which we partake of in the Mass. The ceiling above the sanctuary can be especially helpful in focusing on the altar by the use of a dome or a vault representing the heavens. Next. Father Baker has maybe seen this church. This is the wonderful Gesù Church in Rome, one of my favorites. And this is a little church that we hope to begin construction on this summer, All Saints Church in Kentucky. The tabernacle is rightly seen as an extension of the sacrifice of the Mass, a house for reservation of Christ's body offered on the altar. The conciliar documents see the tabernacle as crucial to the definition of the church. That is, a house of prayer in which the Eucharist is celebrated and reserved. As symbol and presence of the Lord, it seems natural that the altar and tabernacle should be readily identifiable upon entering the church building. Pius XII wrote, "It is one and the same Lord who is immolated on the altar and honored in the tabernacle, and who pours out his blessings from the tabernacle. The tabernacle should be designed and constructed in a manner commensurate with its high status and inherent dignity, and located in a position which engenders the respect of the faithful." Now, this is an incredible example with the sanctuary, the high altar, altarpiece above, pediment, candlesticks, and this major tabernacle right in the center, very large. Not the size you need functionally, but the size you need to be able to see it within the church. And on the right, this Parish Church of All Saints, the parishioners wanted to have the tabernacle behind the altar on the center of the axis of the church. They wanted to see it. They wanted to be prominent. The diocese wanted us to have a Blessed Sacrament chapel, as was originally recommended by the germ. So I said, well, we're Catholics. We believe not in either or, but both and. So I did both, and we have a tabernacle on the wall. So you have a Blessed Sacrament chapel here with a door to the tabernacle, and the same tabernacle, a door faces the people. And the people were delighted with this idea. The liturgists were very unhappy. Next. But they got what they asked for. This is a fun, fanciful reconstruction of the Holy of Holies in the Temple in Jerusalem with the cherubim and seraphim. And this is a design for a beautiful Gothic Baptist church in the 1800s in Chicago. And I guess you can't really see it, but as in good Baptist churches, there's a fabulous pulpit right in the center, and that's the altarpiece. I mean, that's the organ right there. According to canon law, the house for the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament should be placed in a part of the church that is prominent, conspicuous, beautifully decorated, and suitable for prayer. The recent document from the Vatican, the 2000 germ, reaffirms this by allowing the placement of the tabernacle in the sanctuary or in a location visible from the nave. The natural location for the most important elements in a building will be on the central axis. This is why in the synagogue, what do they place at the center? The ark, which holds the scriptures, is the focus. While in many Protestant churches, the pulpit is placed at the center to express their faith in sola scriptura, we who esteem the Eucharist should treat the placement of the tabernacle in a like manner. Next. There are many solutions to reserving the Blessed Sacrament in a prominent way, as a hanging pyx, a wall safe, you see here in the Church of Santa Croce in Florence, a Sacrament tower, the Cathedral of the Madeleine in Salt Lake City, or in the image of a miniature church or Tempietto. The tabernacle can be placed on a special altar or on the main altar and should be raised to a height that is generally visible in the church. As part of the high altar, the design and placement of the tabernacle shall be prominent and will offer a visual connection to the temple in heaven as well as the altar of sacrifice. Next. The crucial issue today, agreed upon by both the laity and the liturgical establishment in the design of Catholic churches in America, is this: what should the relation be between the altar and the tabernacle? Is not the tabernacle rightly seen as the extension of the altar? The house of the Blessed Sacrament only exists because of the altar of sacrifice. Of the 7 sacraments received in the Church, the sacrament of communion is most closely associated with the 2 elements of altar and tabernacle. Therefore, it seems appropriate that the tabernacle keep a certain reference to the altar, since its design and location should express its theological and sacramental link with the Eucharistic celebration. A separate place of reservation of the Blessed Sacrament is allowed as traditional in cathedral shrines in many ancient churches in Rome. That's why I give you these 2 examples, the fabulous Blessed Sacrament Chapel in Santa Maria Maggiore with angels holding up this Tempietto, which is kind of a miniature of the room, this Blessed Sacrament Chapel, and then the fabulous Bernini Tabernacle, also a Tempietto in St. Peter's. It is necessary, however, to remind ourselves how beautiful and spacious these Eucharistic chapels in Rome are, and one must be mindful that for many of the faithful, the church proper, if we do have a Blessed Sacrament chapel in our churches in America, for many of the faithful, the church proper may no longer feel like a place of prayer. Next. The nave. It is not sufficient, though, to have a beautiful altar and a prominent tabernacle within a worthy sanctuary. The rest of the church must follow. The nave is the body of the church in which the faithful gather, symbolizing our spiritual journey toward the beatific vision. Thus, the nave is oriented toward the sanctuary and its center, the altar. Next. In general, the nave will have a vertical proportion reflecting the transcendent proportions and shape of the sanctuary. It should create a beautiful whole, like a body which has a torso in proportion with its head. A threshold can further emphasize the primacy of the sanctuary. This is often accomplished by a triumphal arch. Have an implication here and here of a triumphal arch. Crossing with a dome, a transept, or some other architectural device. The threshold can be employed with more or less unity between the nave and the sanctuary. For instance, some early Christian basilicas, such as Santa Maria and Cosmedin, had a colonnade to which was attached fabric. In medieval churches, a strong separation was accomplished by the use of a screen or even a wall, the ponte or tramezzo, whereas Renaissance and Baroque architects sought for visual unity while maintaining a more subtle physical distinction. Next. In this regard, we may learn something from secular examples. Just as the Louvre does not exhibit the Mona Lisa in the lobby, or the Vatican Museum placed the main entrance directly in front of the Sistine Chapel, so church sanctuaries are normally placed at the end of the nave. The journey towards the holy place is just as important as the arrival. Entrance into the nave should draw us toward the Blessed Sacrament made present on the altar and reserved in the tabernacle. It should differ in architectural design to the sanctuary, either by a similar design or by harmonious contrast. The nave's composition, marked by windows, pilasters, or colonnades, will be related to the scale and proportion of the sanctuary and the altar itself. The nave can be likened to the plot of a novel in which themes are developed which help prepare us for the story's conclusion. Next. The wonderful Marian Church Santa Maria Consolazione in Todi, Italy, and on the left, our first cathedral, the Basilica of the Assumption in Baltimore by La Trobe. In all shapes of churches, whether basilical, cruciform, or hall types, there are architectural motifs which focus on the sanctuary, as well as the altar. Traditionally, the focus on the east was integral to the liturgy and its architecture, reiterating the eschatological hope of the church. Centralized types can also emphasize the sacredness of the ritual, the real action of the Mass, and the real presence of the Eucharist. Within the multiplicity of centralized church types, whether they're circular, oval, octagonal, or cruciform, there is still the definition of a separate sanctuary rather than a mere freestanding altar. Next. A brief word about the theater type, which is so popular today with architects and liturgists. Here is a reconstruction of a Roman theater based on Vitruvius. This is a drawing by the Renaissance architect Palladio. You see the wonderful theater type, and on the left we see the theater type become a church. This is Christ the King in Seattle, built before the Vatican Council. The difficulty with the semicircle or fan shape is that they are forms derived from the theater and entertainment buildings. Many auditoriums and classrooms are built as theaters, which works fine for lectures, but they make for a very mediocre church. The theater form was never a part of Catholic tradition until the advent of modernism. It's interesting. It's one of the first things that the modernists tried to do, whether they're designing Protestant churches or Catholic churches, was to create a new form. And, well, the form they knew well was the theater or the circular theater or what have you. Very interesting. Seemed very functional, I suppose. The theater type is less flexible than the longitudinal or centralized type, having only one focus. And it puts the priest and sometimes the lectors in the role of an entertainer. In the theater type, it is almost impossible to create a sanctuary in which there is a sense of Eastern movement, enclosure, and transcendence. Next. This is the new church of San Juan Capistrano, 1986, in California. Side chapel, Our Lady of Guadalupe, and here the transept of the Gesù in Rome. I don't know if you can focus this or if this is just my bad slide on the right. If you can focus that just a tiny bit. Is there really that much gold in this church, Father? The church building is designed for the liturgy, which is the summit and the font of our life. But it should also accommodate and support private or group devotion, which springs from the liturgy and leads back to the liturgy. What better place to pray the words of Angel Gabriel's Annunciation or to request the intercession of the holy men and women of old than in the nave of a church, in the presence of the altar and the site of the liturgy? To support devotion, devotional shrines should be distinguished from the nave by being given their own place in niches, side walls, or separate chapels. It is not really in harmony with the altar and sanctuary to relegate images of the saints to the least noticeable areas of the church, such as the rear, or to place them in the Blessed Sacrament chapel, as is often done in modern churches and renovations. Next. The elements of the church, such as ambo, baptismal font, confessionals, and the place for musicians, need to be considered in light of these other aspects. The nave and sanctuary are the setting for the elements of sacrament and liturgy, the central sign of the altar, the tabernacle of the real presence, the sacred chrism for anointing, the chair of the priest, the ambo for proclaiming the word of God, the baptistry, and a place for penance. After the placement of the altar and tabernacle, the placement of the other liturgico-sacramental elements follows, though perhaps with a less determined hierarchy. The liturgico-sacramental elements are central to the action of the liturgy, as well as being the visible objects from which the faithful receive the sacraments. They are therefore sacramental elements and objects of special holiness, which should be treated with awe and respect by the faithful. They should, like the altar and tabernacle, be designed using the finest materials possible, and in most instances they should be given a specifically defined area within the body of the church. Next. The facade is the first image of the church that the worshiper sees and is therefore crucial for setting up the sense of the sacred within. Sometimes the exterior tells us things we don't want to hear, such as this church in Washington, D.C. Has a big sign over the front door, "Welcome all sinners." I'm not going in there. It's not for me. I don't know what are they saying. The image of sacrifice and resurrection can be made evident in symbols such as the cross, images of the saints, or even conscious use of similar architectural motifs from inside the church. This is often done in both the Gothic and Spanish traditions, in which the facade becomes a giant reredos, symbolizing the sanctuary brought out to the street. This understanding of the facade is congruent with that pious custom of crossing oneself when passing in front of the church. And I was very moved yesterday standing in front of this ugly Catholic church chapel at Washington Square, and a New Yorker came by with a long ponytail and his T-shirt with something on it, and standard stuff, a couple of earrings. And he walked by where I was standing, and he made the sign of the cross. And then he walked by this beautiful church next door, fabulous building, work of Stanford White, and he just kept walking. That was good. He looked up first, though. It says, Roman Catholic, church, and he looked up, and then he had to look. Next. Okay, and San Marco in Venice, and again, it seems to be my favorite church, the Gesù in Rome on the left, which is a wonderful drawing in which you see half of the facade, and you're also getting a glimpse in the interior, which is the point of what I'm getting at here about the facade. The facade also sets up the central axis of the church. The central axis of the church is expressed on the outside of the building, from the sacred altar to the profane world. At Santa Brigida in Rome, the facade has a pair of columns holding up a broken pediment, giving us a literal intimation of the reredos over the altar. The facade and central portal should frame the altar in the sanctuary, becoming the first threshold we pass over. The portals at San Marco in Venice, as well as the Gesù in Rome, tell us about the interior space of the nave or the sanctuary. It's really pretty amazing that you get a glimpse, even kind of a sense of domes and mosaics and the colonnades on the exterior of this building, as well as the kind of, you get a sense of the high altar here. Next. And this is the, this one somehow got, I'm doing a collage here. These are two images. So you can kind of see, maybe you can kind of see the Spanish Steps there. Imagine it. On the right, this is the beautiful Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. No, I'm sorry, Covington Cathedral in Kentucky. Really amazing Gothic church, which Michael Rose has been trying to save from my profession. The exterior claims the precinct of the church as holy ground. It extends the sanctity of the altar into the world and brings the interior out, though not in a literal way. At the same time, the exterior creates a threshold, so that in crossing it, people understand they are entering a realm set apart for communion with God and His people. The exterior of the church will be the first hint of the nave, the holiness of the sanctuary, and the sacredness of the altar. For some, seeing the exterior of a church will be their only knowledge of Catholicism or of Christ. May it be beautiful. Welcome. And now pretend that you're looking at the front portal of St. Patrick's in New York behind. Can you see that? Kind of. It's a nice collage, isn't it? One of the best ways to do this is to provide the church with an outdoor atrium or piazza, which allows, don't worry about it, please, don't worry about it, which allows people to experience the exterior of the building as well as providing an appropriate anteroom. The atrium or piazza becomes the first room for procession to the altar. The site of a church as the house of God, whether in the countryside or in the city, should be sought in a prominent location to give the building and the Mass true dignity. The understanding of the meaning and holiness of the altar will cause us to make it the most beautiful object possible. The design of other sacramental and devotional elements and the church building itself should follow. The centrality of the Eucharist as commemoration, sacrifice, and communion requires our churches to be elaborate in meaning as well as in their architecture. To think about sacramental architecture in this way can help us to regain the beautiful and the sacred in the liturgy and in our lives. It is my hope and prayer that on the eve of the third millennium, the beginning of the third millennium, we will again design our churches to center on and grow out from Christ present in the most holy altar and tabernacle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Duncan. There's time for questions now.